Hello, I'm Manueltus, and today I want to talk a little bit about symbols, particularly symbols of Nazi Germany, and how those are understood today, and how I believe that, broadly speaking, culturally, they are being reacted to in a manner that is inappropriate. And this is coming off of my explanation of a meme that I had made where I was discussing the question uh, concerning some sideways references to things like a straight arm salute and the phrase Sieg Heil. And I want to be very clear that I believe that those symbols or actions, or memes, as you could call them, as taken individually, have no negative racist or genocidal or implications in as such. I view the Nazi-ness of the symbols to be derived not in their individual components, but rather as a gestalt, or rather as a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. For example, you have a common symbol would be the Reichsadler with the swastika beneath it. And the swastika has been historically used by very many cultures that have varying meanings for it. And although one could say that the Reichsadler with the swastika is indeed a Nazi symbol, I would say that separately they might not be, depending on the context. For example, the Reichsadler is indeed the symbol of Germany, the eagle of the realm, as the translation is. And it has been used for many years before the Nazis even existed as a party or even as an ideology. And the same thing is true for the Totenkopf and Wolfsangel and varying other things such as music that was commonly used during the Nazi regime. A lot of it, besides the ones specifically written about the Nazis, were songs and musical pieces that had existed for a long time previous. And so as well as the Iron Cross as well. And all those symbols, all those memes, all those identifying factors, many of them are distinct from the Nazi ideology and have distinct meanings from that. So I think it's a real shame when the German government is in some ways opposed to certain symbols that actually do not have a Nazi denotation and only a connotation in that sense, such as a straight arm salute, which had entered the cultural consciousness before the existence of the Nazi party. Now, you might argue that it, of course, has been falsely attributed as an ancient symbol, and that might be true. However, it is also true that it did exist before the Nazis did, during the period in which it was introduced artistically and aesthetically. And I would also say that certain things that the Nazi regime did are not necessarily bad in their entirety. For example, the building of the large highways that became the basis for the Autobahn, and that were in many ways inspirational to similar highways throughout the world. And certain advances in science and in technology that were accomplished under the Nazis, I do not think that any of those things were in some respect evil in their entire nature. So I think it's a great mark of maturity to be able to separate those things, to be able to see the world in a way that does not require you to approve of every element of something before having that element, before saying that those elements themselves are good. Or in another sense, to not have to, if there's a single problem in something, a single flaw, that doesn't mean that you're going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So let me be very clear here before people accuse me of varying things. I am very disapproving of the Nazi ideology. I did not approve of racism. I do not approve of genocide. I do not approve of arresting individuals who put out different points of view. Those are things that I do not approve of. I do not approve of the invasions that Hitler led. I do not approve of those things. I want to be very clear on that, because there are individuals who don't have a sense of maturity and who are not capable of acting like adults, and who need to distinguish these things in very simplistic ways. And a great example, I would say, is Antifa. They say they're anti-fascist, and when people say, you're the real fascist, which isn't true, by the way. Antifa are not a fascist group. Let me be very clear on that. If you understand what a fascist is and you have a proper category for what fascism is as an ideology, if you've actually read the Fascist Manifesto, you would know that Antifa are not fascist. However, the Antifa are not capable of distinguishing between fascists and between National Socialists. They aren't capable of distinguishing that. They aren't capable of distinguishing between fascists and reactionaries, who are actually very different. National Socialists and reactionaries who were opposed to each other. So it's very showing that they do not have that type of maturity, the type of ability to create these categories that allow you to distinguish between things. And that's why I think that their ideology is ultimately not as developed as it should be. Because when people accuse them of being fascists, we're not fascists, it's in the name, rather than actually making a serious argument, distinguishing the important facets of fascism when it is properly defined, as opposed to, let's say, the pop definition of simply defining anything that's authoritarian as fascism, which is a very broad and inaccurate definition of what fascism is. And in fact, if you were to undress fascism from symbols and from its name, and you were to take the core elements of fascism, let's say, for example, a non-racist form of fascism, which they do exist. So that, of course, maybe blows the minds of some people that even does exist. And you were to take that, and you were to tell the anti-fascists, the Antifa, which is better, this sort of neutralized form of fascism that they don't know is fascism, or classical liberalism, I'd be very surprised if they didn't pick fascism. Because, in fact, fascism actually has a lot more in common with anarcho-communism and anarcho-socialism and the varying ideologies that Antifa hold than actual classical liberalism. So when they see classical liberals as being closer to fascism than they are, they're actually wrong. And if you were to take a look at the original left-right dichotomy of the French Revolution, fascists and National Socialists would be part of the left wing on that political spectrum. So I think I'm going into this in order to explain that being able to make these distinctions is very important. And so taking cultural symbols that have no denotative properties relating to that, and even fascism with the fasces as its symbol. The fasces have other uses historically, both in Roman culture and in American culture even, if you've ever seen the Lincoln Memorial. So it is worth noting that these symbols have been used by varying cultures, and the use of any of these symbols does not necessarily mean that an individual particularly pertains towards that ideology, unless it is present in a more explicit sense. So I think it's actually rather silly that many of these symbols are banned in Germany, and to the extent that expressing some of these things can even land someone prison time. Because I think that an important thing when opposing ideologies such as National Socialism, such as fascism, such as communism, is a very important thing to do, is to actually be able to identify them. And if you don't allow them to use their own symbols to identify themselves, then how are you going to identify them? How are you going to identify your ideological opponents? And of course, if you don't want people to be converted to their ideology, then you should be putting forward good points that oppose their ideologies and that actually engage with the ideology that they hold. Because if you simply talk past each other, then people are going to be able to simply ignore what you're saying because it doesn't actually address their concerns. And I think that's very important. And how can you know what their concerns are if you will not let them speak? And I think it's somewhat even a question of, then who among us, who among those who are actually opposed to National Socialism, who are actually opposed to fascism, who are actually opposed to communism, who will speak? And I think that there are people who are willing to speak, and who among us who are speaking are going to speak. Are we cowardly? Do we have no arguments? Do we not have an apologetic to make? And I think it's very important that every generation, in some way, is capable of having these arguments, of having these discussions. Because I think there is a weird view of humanity that is very unrealistic, and that is that humans are in some way, in a cultural sense, developing in an internalized cultural sense, that your children are somehow going to benefit from the debates of the parents without having participated in them. I think that's very silly. I don't think that humans have that large degree of inheritable wisdom. Wisdom is something that is developed. Wisdom is something that grows. Wisdom is something that necessarily requires one to think. And I don't think that simply ignoring the other side of the argument, even if you've won the argument 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago with the Nazis, even if you've already won the argument back then, what about the children of tomorrow? They haven't won the argument. Just because you've won the argument doesn't mean that they are capable of winning the argument. So what you need to do is you need to keep the debate going, because otherwise you can't win the argument in the future if you don't have a debate in the future. Because that's what people are going to look at. People aren't going to be looking at what did people say 80 years ago. Let me see. not answering that. People aren't going to be looking at the arguments that are occurring 80 years ago with the Nazis. People aren't going to look at that. People are going to look at what are people saying today? What are today's neo-Nazis saying? And if they're not saying the exact same things that they're saying 80 years ago, then the arguments aren't going to be relevant. So I think it's very important to overcome this idea of this bondage that people have mentally to the past, in the sense that people look at the past and they look at the symbols of the past, and it brings fear into them. That's not what society should be. In a civilized society, in a mature society, individuals are capable of distinguishing these things. Individuals are capable of saying that, of course, Hitler, in his ideology, had a preference for realist art over abstractions. Does that mean that realist art is bad? Of course it doesn't mean that. So you need to be able to separate Hitler as the leader of a brutal regime from Hitler as an art critic, from the actual art itself, and be able to synthesize all these ideas separately and individually to actually come to a conclusion that is mature, one that is well-reasoned, and one that actually answers the questions that your children are asking. And that's what I think is important. And I understand that there are some individuals who are in bondage mentally to these symbols, who do not overcome them, who are not capable from an emotional state to overcome them, and who are still progressing in their maturity till they can reach that point. And for the sake of those people, I'm not going to go around onto the streets Sieg Heiling everything, saying, yeah, I'm American, yeah, America is going to win, Sieg Heil, even though I could do that, and I don't think there'd be anything wrong for me saying that, because who doesn't want to be a winner? No, who doesn't want to be a winner? There's nothing wrong with saying Sieg Heil from a denotative perspective. And you might say it's a term coined by the Nazis, but what is actually racist about that term? What is actually socialist about that term? Nothing is. There's nothing racist, there's nothing socialist about that term. So why is it banned? It's simply guilt by association. That's it. That's all of it. So I'm not going to go out into the streets and yell it at the top of my lungs. Why? Because I have weaker brothers who need to mature, and so I have to be aware of my company when I do these things. Because I like music, let's say Johann Gottfried Piefke. He was a musician a composer in Germany, and he before the time of Hitler, and he made a lot of music, some of which Hitler liked very much. So now, certain of his songs have become associated with the Nazis, even though there's nothing actually about the Nazis, and it predates the existence of the Nazis themselves. And I want to be able to enjoy the music that I like that is not actually Nazi propaganda. It's not. So there you go. So if this may sound a bit Pauline in the sense that I'm saying that there are individuals for whom's sake I'm not going to go all out, it is Pauline in essence. It is a similar thing to what Paul of Tarsus said in relation to meat that was offered up to idols. But I'm not going to get into that because that's more a theological discussion. But I have a similar attitude regarding these things, that there are these things that I like aesthetically. There are aesthetic benefits, aesthetic boons, things that were appreciated by Hitler and the Nazis, and just because someone I don't like appreciated something doesn't mean I can't appreciate it also. And that's my opinion. So tell me what you think. Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think that I'm secretly a Nazi. I'm a crypto-Nazi somehow, out in hiding somewhere, because I'm not. I'll tell you that. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.